Coming up on Locked On Dodgers, the Hall of Fame vote ballot results are in. We'll talk about that, and we'll talk about the latest round of negotiations between MLB and the Players Union. So basically the same episode as yesterday, except with different news. So let's get Locked On Dodgers.
You are Locked On Dodgers, your daily Los Angeles Dodgers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Dodger fans. I am Jeff Snider of Baseball Essential, and this is Locked On Dodgers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm flying solo today, but Vince will hopefully be back with me tomorrow. I want to thank you for making Locked On Dodgers your first listen every day. Remember, this show is free and available on all podcast platforms and on YouTube simply by searching for Locked On Dodgers. This is the daily podcast covering the Los Angeles Dodgers, bringing you the smart fans' perspective on our boys in blue. And like I said in the opening, Hall of Fame votes are in, and we now know who is getting into the Hall of Fame this year and who's not. And so I'm going to talk about that. And then I'm going to talk about the latest round of negotiations between MLB and the union. And then, we'll see where that takes us. There's a lot of comments from fans and former players and current players and everything in between. So plenty to talk about with the Hall of Fame voting. So first, let's talk about the negotiations between the league and the union. And basically, it's Tuesday's session was overall, I think it was positive. It wasn't what we hoped for, but it was about as good as we should have hoped for, I guess. I guess I should say it wasn't the ultimate thing we're hoping for. They didn't come to an agreement, but there didn't appear to be any setbacks. And if anything, it seems like they agreed on some frameworks. Now they got to hammer out the details. According to Jeff Passan, he said, here's what happened today. MLB agreed to accept parameters of a pre-arbitration bonus pool for top 30 WAR. MLBPA, the union, seeking $105 million. The league offered $10 million. So basically, the league agreed to the parameters of a system where young players who aren't yet eligible for arbitration or free agency, so they're just making the league minimum or somewhere around there, there would be a bonus pool for them, and the best performers in that group would get a chunk of that bonus pool. It's a good system, I think. It's something that seems like a solid compromise for a way to get some of these younger guys paid and let young guys bet on themselves a little bit. I think we would be less likely to see situations like the Ozzie Albies contract is one I always come back to, that he signed this big, long extension because there's no guarantee that he's going to make it to free agency without getting hurt or something. And so he kind of had to take that extension for that long-term security for his family, even though he would have obviously made a lot more than that in free agency once he got there, assuming he stayed healthy. This would allow a guy like Albies to earn some of that money. And so if Albies had already earned $4 or $5 million in his career at that point, so the immediate financial crunch or whatever is gone, well, then maybe he holds out for a better contract. So I think overall that would be a good thing for the Players Union, help get some, players paid more earlier and paid more in the long run. Obviously, it's a big difference that the league offered $10 million and the union wanted $105 million. So there is definitely something to be figured out there. You would assume both of those numbers are probably pie in the sky wish numbers, and to start the negotiation with, and we can expect that they'll probably end up agreeing on something in the middle. I guess the middle would be $57.5 million, something like that. So, somewhere in the $60 million range, probably they'll end up agreeing. And that's a good step in the right direction. So the fact that they agreed on the framework, I'm seeing as a good step. The next thing Passan mentions as happening today said MLB offered to raise the minimum salary to $615,000. The union wants $775,000. Just to keep up with inflation from the last CBA, it would need to be about 650,000. And so it seems like that's going to be the bare minimum. But again, these are numbers that they're throwing out to start the negotiations, and usually it'll end up somewhere in the middle. And in the middle of these would be 695,000. And I imagine that's something that both sides could see as, if not a victory, at least something that they can live with. And so the fact that they're exchanging numbers, to me, is a positive sign. It's a good thing. Okay, we know what we need to figure out. Now we can get down to the nitty-gritty. And then the last thing they mentioned, MLB withdrew offer to change arbitration structure. I don't totally understand what that means, but I think it's less negative than it sounds. When they say MLB withdrew offer, it sounds like they're saying, but we changed our mind on this. I think this is more of a compromise kind of thing, but I need to do more digging on that. So don't hold me to anything on that. But those are the things that Jeff Passan reported as happening, and the things I understand, the things that we kind of have data on or understanding of. Yeah, it's positive. It's movement in the right direction. It's still not a deal. It's still, I'm feeling optimistic right now because I didn't expect them to get to this point until around mid-February when spring training was supposed to have started. So the fact that they are getting started with frameworks early a little bit leaves me hopeful that we might not miss any of the regular season. That's what I'm hoping for. I'm still going to hold out hope at this point that they'll actually get it hammered out and spring training can start on time. But if nothing else, if they can get it done by the end of February, then they can still have an abbreviated spring training but still start the season on time. So that's what I'm hoping for. And all in all, it seems like a good, productive day. I didn't hear anything about if they have another session scheduled, another negotiation scheduled. So I imagine they're both going to go back to their own camps and talk about things, but they have some momentum going. So you would assume that they will get together again soon, hopefully, and hopefully continue to hash some of this stuff out. That's what I'm hoping anyway. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but right now at this moment, as I'm recording this at 11:04 p.m. Mountain Time on Tuesday night, I'm feeling reasonably optimistic. So that's my thoughts on the labor stuff. I'm going to come back in a minute. I'm going to start talking about the Hall of Fame stuff. What happened, my thoughts from some players, some fans, etc. So plenty to talk about. And with regards to that, I want to thank you for making Locked On Dodgers your first listen every day, and keep it Locked On Dodgers. Hey, if you're trying to eat healthier in the new year, Built Bar is at least part of the answer, because Built Bar is delicious, tastes like a candy bar, but it's actually good for you. It makes it so much easier to stick to your resolutions, because when you want chocolate, just go grab a Built Bar. They're all covered in chocolate. The other day I had a sweet tooth and I went and grabbed a cookie dough chunk Built Bar and I ate that and I'm like, man, that was good. And then I'm like, and I don't even have to feel bad about it because it's actually good for me. Most Built Bars contain about 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, and 17 grams of protein. Compare that to a candy bar, which is hundreds and hundreds of calories, dozens of grams of sugar and carbs, just way too much junk. So Built Bar is the way to go. If you don't know what flavor you like, order a mix box. They'll send you a bunch of different flavors. You can decide that way. And then you can order more specifically the next time. But whenever you do order, go to Built.com and use promo code LOCKED15 and you will get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. All right, so the Hall of Fame results are in. And on yesterday's show, I gave my prediction, which was that David Ortiz would get in by the skin of his teeth and nobody else would get in. And that ended up being exactly what happened. Ortiz got about 77.5% of the vote. So just, probably 10 or 12 votes more than he needed to get the 75%. All in all, he got in, which is good. It's his first time on the ballot. And that doesn't really matter. But, getting it on your first try is meaningful to the players, I think, and the actual percentage, not that big a deal. Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, Sammy Sosa all fell short, and Curt Schilling, all four of them fell short in their last year on the ballot. And so they are all now off the ballot, not in the Hall of Fame. At least some of them will pop up on the Veterans Committee ballot this coming December. And so we'll see what happens then. It'll be interesting to see, because it's mostly the younger generation that has been voting for Bonds and Clemens. I saw a thing that like 89 new voters have come on since Bonds and Clemens joined the ballot, and 81 of them voted for Bonds and Clemens. I think that was right. And so the vast majority of new voters are voting for Bonds and Clemens. It's the old school guard that isn't. And the veterans committees are made up of old school people, old school players, old school executives, old school, everybody's old school. And I'm interested to see, I thought that might mean that they're not going to have any better luck with the veterans committee at this point, until I started seeing some thoughts from former players. And to be fair, these are, more recent former players. One of the interesting ones that I liked, Tony Gwynn Jr. So his dad's a Hall of Famer. Tony Gwynn Jr. played for 10 or so years in the big leagues. Good guy, former Dodger, was a guest on a former podcast of mine, and obviously knows a lot about baseball, growing up with Tony Gwynn as a dad. And he said, congratulations to David Ortiz on his Hall of Fame election. The best DH of his era and one of the most clutch hitters of all time, certainly deserving. That being said, it's a shame and disappointing to not see Bonds, Clemens, and Schilling get in, especially Bonds for me. There just wasn't many, if any, that could do what Barry could do on the diamond. He was the best hitter I ever shared a field with, and the best hitter I've seen in person other than my dad. Winky emoji. All three dominated the era they played in. For those that want to debate PEDs, I get it. During that time, from college to the minors to the big leagues, there were a ton of guys using. Not excusing it, but that is a part of the era of baseball, whether we like it or not. A guy like Tony Gwynn Jr. would have a lot of incentive to want to keep a guy like Bonds out, because, presumably Tony Gwynn Sr. did it the right way. He played during the steroid era, the end of his career was during the steroid era, and presumably Tony Gwynn Sr. did things the right way, didn't use PEDs, and so you could understand if Tony Gwynn Jr. was grumpy about these guys who did, but he's not. What he says is Barry Bonds was the best player I ever saw, except for my dad, and so he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. And it's really it's hard to know what the right answer is, because there's no set rule on how do we deal with these PED guys. And a lot of people want the Hall of Fame to issue, a statement. Here is how to deal with the PED guys. And I don't know if that's the right answer or not. It's kind of interesting because the character clause that is in the Hall of Fame voting, where it says just, basically you're supposed to take into account a person's character. We only use that as a punishment. We never use it as a bonus for a guy's case. For example, Dale Murphy. Dale Murphy was a borderline Hall of Famer, looked to be a sure Hall of Famer, and then his career fell off because of injuries. But Dale Murphy, by all accounts, everyone who's ever met him, including me, says he is the nicest guy in the world, great guy, great competitor, very, everything you want in a baseball player, Dale Murphy was. And yet, he doesn't get a character clause bump for being awesome. There's plenty of guys who are awesome, and maybe that character clause should bump them into the Hall of Fame. But we only use it as a punishment. And so we use it against guys like, Pete Rose never even got on the ballot for different reasons, but, Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds and Curt Schilling and all these guys don't get in because of the character clause, basically. And I don't know if I like that, because the fact is there are people in the Hall of Fame. I know this is an original point that I'm about to make, but that doesn't mean it's not true, because it is true. There are people in the Hall of Fame who cheated. There are people in the Hall of Fame who we know cheated, and we know how they cheated. Gaylord Perry threw spitballs. Don Sutton, when Don Sutton was asked, did you ever scuff the ball? Did you ever apply, doctor a ball? Don Sutton said, I was never caught doctoring a ball. He basically admitted Don Sutton cheated. It's funny. Phil Niekro probably did. We know his brother did. Plenty of guys in the Hall of Fame currently cheated in a way that we know about. Now, There's other guys. Ricky Henderson is in the Hall of Fame. I do not know Ricky Henderson. I've never met him. I am not going to say definitively what he did or did not do because I am aware of slander laws. I am just going to say it is hard for me to imagine a world where Ricky Henderson did not use every means available to him to be the best baseball player he could possibly be. Now, were steroids available to Ricky Henderson? I don't know. If Ricky Henderson didn't use steroids, in my opinion, it's because he didn't know where to get them. Ricky Henderson wanted to be the best player there was. And, if he didn't cheat, it's only because he didn't know how to do it. There are plenty of guys who either cheated and we know for sure, or cheated and we can be pretty sure. That's even before you get into, the greenies from the 50s and 60s, basically speed. They were popping pills to give them energy. They're things that are illegal now and that were not healthy then and gave them an unfair advantage. There are plenty of guys in the Hall of Fame who use those things. All of these things. If we start getting, and then you get into like personalities. There are jerks in the Hall of Fame. There are people who beat up their wives in the Hall of Fame. There are drunk drivers in the Hall of Fame. There are people with bad politics. If you're listening to the podcast and not watching, I did air quotes about that because what politics are bad is definitely in the eye of the beholder. But there are people with quote unquote bad politics in the Hall of Fame. There are active, open racists in the Hall of Fame, including a commissioner of baseball who was a racist and created the system that made the color line so strong that it took decades for Jackie Robinson to break it. There are terrible people in the Hall of Fame who did great things on the baseball field or for the game of baseball. And that's why they're in the Hall of Fame. Some people shouldn't be in at all. And you could argue about some of these commissioners who are in the Hall of Fame. Basically, the only qualification to get in the Hall of Fame as a commissioner is, were you a commissioner and are you not anymore? And that doesn't seem like enough of a qualification for me. But so some of these people are in who shouldn't be. But there are plenty of people who are in the Hall of Fame because of what they did on the baseball field. Even though they were terrible people or maybe terrible people, I'm fine with that. And the hard part is now that everything is so publicized, social media, everything, knowing that if Barry Bonds had been elected, he would give a speech at the induction ceremony. And I think that's something a lot of people don't want to deal with because they don't like Barry Bonds. I'm positive that's what it was with Curt Schilling. Nobody wants to hear Curt Schilling's speech. None of the voters do, so they didn't vote for him. I think that's a terrible reason. And I think, you know what? If you can't handle 10 minutes of somebody you don't like talking, get a different job. Let the people you don't like say what they want to say. It's not like Curt Schilling is going to go up there and like actively be a racist in his speech. He's going to say things. He's going to be typical Curt Schilling. You might find that obnoxious. You might not. But, if you can't handle hearing somebody you dislike or disagree with saying words, that is a you problem, not a them problem. I'm not saying I would like to hear them. I'm saying it's easy to not listen, or it's easy to listen and not get upset about it. It's part of being an adult. And so all these people, it's like, well, we don't want to honor Curt Schilling. We don't want to honor Barry Bonds. We don't want to honor Roger Clemens. Why not? There are great baseball players who are deserving on the field of being in the Hall of Fame. So they should be in the Hall of Fame, even if that means they get to stand on a microphone for 10 minutes and say things you don't like. Boo-hoo. I called Dick Monfort a baby yesterday. Plenty of babies in the BBWAA who don't want to vote for Curt Schilling because he's a bad guy. Get over it. I'm going to take a break. I'm going to talk some more about some other reactions to the Hall of Fame results. So thank you again for making Locked On Dodgers your first listen every day, and keep it Locked On Dodgers. BetOnline would like to wish you a happy new betting year as we continue our march to the playoffs and beyond. BetOnline remains the number one spot for all the best sports wagering action of 2022. New year and a new updated desktop and mobile website to sign up today and receive a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Just use our promo code LOCKEDON to get started. From football, basketball, hockey, boxing, and UFC, right to your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for 2022. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to wager on all your favorite sports. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, some more talk about the Hall of Fame. I guess I should talk about Sammy Sosa. It's kind of funny how Sosa's name hasn't come up as much, even though there were 4 guys who dropped off the ballot: Clemens, Bonds, Schilling, and Sosa. Sosa got the fewest votes of all of them, and he doesn't get mentioned as much. And I think it makes sense. Like I may have shared my Sosa stance before. I probably have. But I'll say it again. For me, Sammy Sosa, unlike Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens, I feel like Sammy Sosa was a creation of steroids. Sammy Sosa, pre-steroids, was not a good baseball player. And then he got huge and started hitting a bunch of home runs. And, and then they started testing for steroids and his career fell off a cliff. And so for me, I would have a hard time voting for Sosa simply because he was, in my mind, a creation of steroids. Whereas Bonds was a great player who, was insecure about attention other people were getting, including Sosa and McGwire. And so he used steroids to get even better. Clemens, same kind of thing, used steroids to get even better, but was already a great player. Sosa was not a great player to start with. So that's why I would draw the line between them. And I think, even though most people don't say that out loud, I think that's probably kind of a common perception, because people are much less upset about Sosa than they are about some of these other guys. Getting back to Bonds and Clemens, Justin Brule, Dodgers relief pitcher Justin Brule, on Twitter had some interesting things to say. He said, Roger Clemens never failed a drug test and can't get into the Hall of Fame, but Big Papi can fail a drug test and that's perfectly okay. Moral of the story is it doesn't matter if you did steroids or not. It only matters if the writers like you. There are morals and ethics committee nowadays. Justin Brule obviously has strong feelings. I don't totally agree with him. I get where he's coming from. For me, the big difference, like I've said all along, I understand why some people wouldn't vote for Clemens and Bonds. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. For me, the big difference between Clemens and David Ortiz is, 2 big differences. A, Roger Clemens was named heavily in the Mitchell report. So no, he never failed a drug test, but it is undeniable that Roger Clemens used steroids. So that's one thing. It's not, you can't use the never failed a drug test to actually imply that Clemens didn't use steroids, because he did. He's in the Mitchell report. It's documented, and I'm not saying the Mitchell report is perfect, but it's pretty undeniable at this point that Roger Clemens used steroids. So there's that. But on the Big Papi side, the thing about David Ortiz is, yes, he probably failed that drug test in 2003 that was supposed to be anonymous. It was leaked. His name was on there. So yeah, he probably did fail that one. But because of the way it was done then, because it was supposed to be anonymous, there was no appeal. There was no second test in case of a false positive, blah, 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 blah. It's possible that Ortiz didn't actually use steroids and it was a false positive. I don't think it's likely, but it's possible. But even more importantly, David Ortiz played the vast majority of his career in the testing and punishment era, where if he had tested positive, he would have been suspended. And yet he never tested positive under that system. And so does that mean he never did steroids again? I don't know. But it seems pretty clear. I can totally understand why people would draw a line between that, where David Ortiz, yeah, even if he failed that 2003 test, he hit 500 home runs during the testing and punishment era and was never punished for it. Lots of people got suspended during that time. Alex Rodriguez got suspended. Manny Ramirez got suspended twice. David Ortiz never did. And so it's perfectly logical and rational to assume, okay, he must not have done steroids during that time. And that's, I think that's a fair thing to vote on. Now, I get Justin Brule's overall point, and I think I mostly agree with it, that the writers involved in voting are worried too much about morals and ethics. And I do wish that it would go back to just let's focus on what they did on the field. I have a good friend named Russ who was texting me tonight about the Hall of Fame, and he was talking about is it too subjective, having these writers vote, and he was like just kind of spitballing ideas about if there could be a way to make it more of a meritocracy getting into the Hall of Fame and less of a subjective personal opinion kind of thing. And for me, the hard part is, we don't have perfect stats. There's so many different ways to be valuable, to be a good baseball player, and so how are you going to tell me whether Lou Brock or Ernie Banks was more valuable? Because they did it in totally different ways, played different positions, had different skill sets, And yeah, I mean, wins above replacement tries to approximate that value, and it does a better job than most things we've seen, but it's not perfect. And even more to the point, my point to my buddy Russ was, I think, I think part of the appeal of the Hall of Fame is the arguments. I think the Hall of Fame is probably happy that people are arguing about this right now, even though some of the arguments are people saying, I have no respect for the Hall of Fame. I'll never go there again. Okay. But I think people would care less if there wasn't any drama. We refer to Clayton Kershaw as a future Hall of Famer, but if he was literally already guaranteed a spot in the Hall of Fame, that wouldn't be as much fun. If Mike Trout already knew for sure he was going in the Hall of Fame, wouldn't be as fun. Yes, Mike Trout's going in the Hall of Fame. He could retire today and he would go in the Hall of Fame in 5 years, but that's not for sure. And there would still be the drama of, okay, well, how many votes does he get? Ken Griffey Jr. was Mike Trout before Mike Trout. And then Ken Griffey Jr.'s second half of his career was much worse. And, so there was all that drama, not about is he going to make it, but how many votes is he going to get? What's it going to be like? And I think that's part of the excitement and the benefit of this Hall of Fame discussion. And so for the most part, I like this. I am in favor of them tweaking the voting process or something, just to, I don't know. I don't necessarily think the system they have right now is perfect. I wish that writers' votes were made public. The BBWA voted strongly in favor of making all their votes public, and the Hall of Fame didn't act on that. And so now it is up to each individual voter, and there's still some who don't want to make their votes public. I think that would make the system better if their votes were all public. I think there are things that they could do, even changing the electorate a little bit. If it wasn't just the BBWAA, if other things were involved, I don't think fan involvement should be part of it. I think fans are much more split, closer to 50-50 on whether Bonds and Clemens should be in. We've seen all-star voting is a terrible way to do it. I think if the fans were involved, we would get even more of a big market bias in, players who played for the Yankees and the Dodgers would get in more often than other teams, which is fine, but wouldn't make it more of a meritocracy. And so I think figuring out a way to make it more of a meritocracy, and also, like I talked about before, identifying ways to include fame, because guys like Steve Garvey and Don Mattingly, who were super famous, I feel like that fame ought to give them a little bonus. So there's things I would tweak, but overall, I think it's a good thing that we have these arguments, that we have these debates, that people have different opinions, because that's one of the fun things about sports, is being passionate about things. And that's kind of my thoughts on the Hall of Fame. That's going to wrap it up for me, at least on the podcast. If you're watching on YouTube and you want to stick around after my conclusion, I'm just going to open up a couple packs of baseball cards. So if you're just listening on the podcast, hope you'll hop over onto YouTube and watch it there too. I'm just going to open a pack of 1987 Topps and 1987 Fleer, and just go through and talk about what cards I get and some of my memories of those players. So just kind of a YouTube exclusive. So feel free to check that out. If you're not watching already, hop over to YouTube. Thank you for making Locked On Dodgers your first listen every day. For your second listen, go ahead and check out Locked On Bets. It's a great podcast. If you're into betting on sports, you definitely want to check out Locked On Bets. If you're not listening to Locked On Dodgers or watching it every day, we would love if you add 1 or 2 days a month to your rotation. If you have friends or family who might be interested in the show, please tell them about it. You can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Locked On Dodgers. Vince is on Twitter at Vince Samperio. I'm on Twitter at Snydog, and the DMs are open in all of those places. Our email address is lockedondodgers@gmail.com, and our phone number for voicemails or texts is 323-863-LOCK, 5625. We are here every weekday morning, and we hope you'll be here with us. When you get in your car or sit on your couch, tell your smart device to play podcast Locked On Dodgers. And remember, you don't have to agree, you just have to listen. We'll talk to you tomorrow. And now for my YouTube friends, let's jump in. I'll do the tops first, I guess. This 87 Topps set was one of my favorites as a kid. My brother and I, we called it the Woodies because it is the set where the background of the card, the border of the card is kind of a wood grain. Looks pretty nice. Obviously, it comes with the gum. This is, 35-year-old gum. And so I would not recommend chewing that. I will probably chew it tomorrow because I make poor decisions in my life. But let's jump into this pack. Obviously, there's the Spring Fever Baseball. So with this card, you can win a trip for 4 to the 1988 spring training camp of the team of your choice. I suspect that might not be valid anymore. I don't think they've mastered time travel in 87 Topps. Our first card is Paul Molitor, Hall of Famer Paul Molitor. Molitor is a good way for me to plug tomorrow, I believe, Thursday's episode of Locked On MLB, hosted by Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call him Sully. I was on that episode doing kind of a game show against, what's his name? Lindsay. What's Lindsay's last name? I'm sure Lindsay, he has a last name. He's a new host of Locked On MLB Prospects and good guy. Lindsay something. I can't find him right now. But anyway, I was on the podcast going up against Lindsay in a game show, and Paul Molitor came into play, helped me have more success than I would have. Otherwise, I'm not going to spoil it for you and tell you if I won or lost. I'm just going to tell you that Paul Molitor came up. Paul Molitor is an interesting one just because when I was growing up, I didn't think of him as Lindsey Crosby, that's his name. I didn't necessarily think of Molitor as a Hall of Famer, but then he got 3,000 hits and just he ended up being kind of an obvious Hall of Famer. But at the time, when I got this card, I didn't think, oh, that's a future Hall of Famer. It was just like, oh, there's Paul Molitor. Yeah, he plays for the Brewers. Up next, we have Rob Wilfong of the Angels, a second baseman. Rob Wilfong, to me, as a kid, was kind of the same person as Bobby Grich, played the same position as Bobby Grich for the same team. Both guys had a mustache. Basically, he's the poor man's Bobby Grich. And I'm always surprised to see how long Rob Wilfong played in the big leagues. He started in 1977, I think that says. So this was his 10th season already. And Rob Wilfong, nothing special, not a very good player, but kind of a cool 80s baseball name. Next, we got Sammy Stewart. Sammy Stewart, in my mind, was the same person as Danny Darwin. You guys probably hear me talk about same person. My brother and I people we got confused for whatever reason, but Sammy Stewart was the same person as Danny Darwin. I wonder if my brother would agree on that. Like a lot of people in the 80s, had a pretty good mustache. And not much else to speak of about Sammy Stewart that sets him apart. I think of him as an Oriole. And looking at the back of his card, this is his first year with the Red Sox after spending his entire career 8 years beforehand with the Orioles. So I am correct to think of him as an Oriole, I guess. Up next, this is an interesting one on a Dodgers connection. Sorry, I pulled a piece of gum out of my mouth and some of it is stuck to my finger. Glad that this is just on YouTube, so, some struggles are expected. Alfredo Griffin. Alfredo Griffin was, as you probably know, traded to the Dodgers before the 1988 season, along with Jay Howell. Jay Howell became the Dodgers closer. I think Mike Davis came over in that trade too to play the outfield. Mike Davis had a terrible year in 88, but played a big part. He drew the walk and stole the base before Kirk Gibson's home run. And Alfredo Griffin came over to be the Dodgers starting shortstop and was in 88 until he got hit by a Dwight Gooden fastball in the hand. broke his hand, and that's why Dave Anderson spent most of the 88 season as the Dodgers' starting shortstop. Up next is Dave Stapleton. If I remember right, Dave Stapleton, so 87 tops, this is from the 86 season, and Dave Stapleton played a big role in the 1986 postseason by not doing something. In the famous Game 6 of the 86 World Series, when Mookie Wilson hit the ground ball that went under Bill Buckner's glove, a lot of people believe, and I think it's kind of undeniable, that Dave Stapleton should have been in the game playing first base. It's kind of indefensible that Bill Buckner was in that game. Dave Stapleton was a significantly better defensive first baseman, and maybe things go different for the Red Sox in that World Series if Dave Stapleton had been in the game. Oh, here's a fun one, and I'll get a bonus card here too. Sid Bream, former Dodger. This is his second year with the Pirates. And Sid Bream is maybe most famous as scoring. I think he scored the winning run for the Braves on the against the Pirates in the whatever year that was, 90. I can't remember. All those years run together in my mind. 92 maybe, 91 or 92. The hit by Francisco Cabrera, Sid Bream scored, but Sid Bream also has the honor of being one of the goofiest looking dudes I ever saw. And I'm pretty sure he must have had some plastic surgery at some point during his career, because by this point, he just kind of looked like your average guy with a mustache. But I have another card here, his 85 tops card. It's in very bad condition, which is why I have it here. My brother and I, if you remember the podcast that my brother was on with me a week or two ago, we talked about taking terrible care of our baseball cards, and I happened to see this card the next day, and so I pulled it out as an example of that. But this is my Sid Bream 1985 tops card, and between the creases and everything, you can kind of see he was not a super handsome man, and it seems like he may have had some work done on the mouth area of himself. Our next card, Lonnie Smith. Speaking of those Braves teams, Lonnie Smith was on those teams. My main Lonnie Smith story is that when I was a kid, I kind of assumed that Lonnie Smith and Ozzie Smith were brothers because they both played for the Cardinals and their last name was Smith. They are not brothers and never were, and I should have known that, but that's my Lonnie Smith thoughts. Oh, speaking of those Braves, another one, Rafael Belliard. Another guy who ended up on the Braves. At this point, he was on the Pirates, had been for his whole career. Rafael Belliard was a very bad hitter. He was 3 feet tall. I think he's listed at 5'6", maybe. Just a little guy and not very good, but he had a decently long career for as bad as he was at baseball. So that's interesting. Up next, we got Charlie Huff, former Dodger Charlie Huff, part of the original Marlins team when the Marlins were an expansion team, pitched until he was 900 years old, and still coaches in the Dodgers organization. Great guy, super fun to talk to. You'll sometimes run into him at a Dodgers minor league game. He's a roving instructor. I had the opportunity to talk to him with my two sons at a Rancho Cucamonga Quakes game a couple years ago. Had a really good time talking to him, and he loves talking baseball and really, really knows his stuff. Up next is Cecil Cooper. Cecil Cooper was a very good player. Had some great seasons with the Red Sox early in his career. By this point, he had been on the Brewers for a long time and was one of those guys who, not a Hall of Famer, but just a really, really good hitter, good baseball player. And this was probably the last card, or one of the last cards of Cecil Cooper before there started being confusion about what his first name was, how it should be pronounced, because he was Cecil. Everybody who spelled like that is Cecil. And then Cecil Fielder came back from Japan. He's like, by the way, my name's Cecil. And now it's like, wait, are all Cecils pronounced Cecil? No, just Cecil Cooper, or Cecil Fielder. Cecil Cooper is still Cecil Cooper. Speaking of Rob Wilfong and Bobby Grich, here's Bobby Grich. Bobby Grich should be in the Hall of Fame. Bobby Grich is one of the best second basemen in baseball history. Absolutely deserving of the Hall of Fame. My son, last year when he was in 8th grade, did a report on Bobby Grich and how he should be in the Hall of Fame. He talked on Zoom to Jay Jaffe, who is a Hall of Fame expert and definitely part of the Bobby Grich fan club. about that. And yeah, Bobby Grich should be in the Hall of Fame. Great second baseman and just very, very underrated for his career. Up next is Bill Mooneyham. The only thing I know about Bill Mooneyham is this baseball card. Don't know anything else about him. Looks like this is his rookie card. I don't know how much longer he played in his career, but the one thing I know about Bill Mooneyham is that he is a right-handed pitcher for the A's, because that's what this baseball card teaches me. Let's see what it says on the back. Bill played baseball and basketball in high school. He attended Merced, California Community College. Well, congratulations, Bill Mooneyham. Couple more cards. Tommy Herr. Tommy Herr had the really cool distinction in 1985. He hit 8 home runs and drove in 110 runs. So having single-digit home runs and triple-digit RBIs doesn't happen very often. Tommy Herr was a really good player for those Cardinals teams, stole a lot of bases, not as many as Vince Coleman and Willie McGee, but really good, and was eventually traded to the Twins and wasn't happy about that. Went to the Phillies later, I think, but his time with the Cardinals, he was a very, very good player. Up next is Bob Melvin. Bob Melvin, currently the manager of the San Diego Padres, has been the manager of the A's for a long time, and he just jumped over to the Padres this offseason. So was not much of a baseball player, but is a pretty darn good manager, and we'll see if he has what it takes to turn those Padres around. Gary Lucas. Gary Lucas is from Riverside, California, and I went to a baseball camp once where Gary Lucas and Alvin Davis of the Mariners were the star major leaguers at this baseball camp. It was in Riverside. I think they went to the same high school, and it was at their high school maybe. And, this says that Gary Lucas was 6'5", I think. I'm pretty sure he was 13 feet tall, was the tallest guy I'd ever seen. And my recollection of this camp, I'm sure that these weren't the actual words they said, but they were definitely the words I heard. Gary Lucas told me, "I sure hope you can hit." And Alvin Davis told me, "I sure hope you can pitch." So not what you're hoping for at a baseball camp, but, it is what it is. I ended up playing all through high school because I could pitch. I couldn't hit very well, but I could pitch. So I got to play through high school, and then I was done, and I was okay with that. And our last card, our actual last card is a checklist, so we're going to just skip that. Those are boring. So our other last card is Eric Davis. At this point, he was a future Dodger, and Eric Davis, this was kind of the peak of his career. Everything about Eric Davis, you just look at him. He was just cool. Eric Davis was maybe the coolest player in baseball. Grew up, was childhood friends with Darryl Strawberry. They ended up playing together on the Dodgers, fulfilling their lifelong dream. Should have been our lifelong dream. It didn't work out. But Eric Davis, whenever somebody asks if you could, keep one player healthy for their whole career, just see what they did. For me, it's Eric Davis. If he had stayed healthy, man, he was so good, so fast, so powerful, had the cool batting stance, looked good in a uniform. Everything about Eric Davis was awesome. And so that's that card. What are we at? We're about 43 minutes. All right, I'm going to do this Fleer pack too. And, hope you guys don't mind me going a little bit long. And you can pick up the episode, a little bit later if you want to. 1987 Fleer, as always, has the stickers. So we got the Rangers and the Phillies with the Expos on the back. I don't know what you're supposed to do with that, but that's cool, I guess. Alan Ashby. I have a fun Alan Ashby story. So Alan Ashby's son lived in the same apartment complex as me in college. Justin Ashby is his name. And my job, when people moved into the apartment complex, my job was to take their picture because we had a little directory with phone numbers and email addresses for all these people who lived in the apartment complex. So I was in charge of getting the pictures. And I met Justin, and I'd have them write their name, kind of like they do at spring training. They write their name on a piece of paper and hold it up so that when I was then going through and creating the directory, their name was right there in the picture. And I saw Justin Ashby, and I said, "Are you related to Alan Ashby?" And he looked at me like I was the biggest weirdo in the world, that my first question for him is, "Are you related to Alan Ashby?" And it was especially weird because the answer was, "Yes, he's my dad." So that's my Alan Ashby story. Up next, Bruce Bochy. Bruce Bochy had almost the same name as Bruce Bochy. Both of them were bad baseball players in the 80s. Bruce Bochy had been around for about a dozen years at this point, and was probably better than Bruce Bochy, but not very good still. And all I know about Bruce Bochy, in fact, I'm just learning now that he played for the Angels, the Indians, and the Mariners before he played for the A's. I might have known the Mariners, but Angels and Indians are news to me. But that's all I know about Bruce Bochy. Now we got a prospects card. Tracy Jones and Marvin Freeman. Both of these guys did end up, actually having decent major league careers, but neither of them has anything to write home about or anything for me to say anything about. Up next is Gary Renicky. His brother, Ron Renicky, has been a Dodgers coach, Dodgers player. Gary Renicky spent most of his career in the American League, was not... I don't know which was better, Gary Renicky or Ron Renicky, but Ron Renicky has definitely had the longer post-playing career in baseball. He's coached, he's managed, all those things, and one of them had a son. I think it was Gary that had a son who played in the big leagues for a little bit. Up next is Bob Kearney. I don't know how it's pronounced. Bob Kearney is one of those guys who the only thing I know about him is he's a Mariners catcher, and I know that from baseball cards. No stories about him. Mike Pagliarulo, famous for being basically the same person as Don Mattingly, just the poor man's Don Mattingly. Batted left, threw right, played third base, and showed some promise as a hitter, but never quite lived up to it all the way. Up next is Dan Plesac, whose nephew Zach Plesac pitches in the big leagues now. Dan Plesac works for MLB Network, or at least he did last I knew. And I liked him more as a baseball player because I didn't have to hear him talk. He says things that I consider to be dumb, but I don't get upset because I'm a grown-up, and grown-ups can hear things they don't like. Up next is a checklist. Boring. I did like that Fleer would actually sort their players by team. So in the set, so numbers 96 through 120 were the Yankees. 121 through 143 were the Rangers, et cetera, et cetera. So I kind of like that Topps did that. I don't know if that was better or not. Next is Billy Joe Robideau. Had a cool name, great name. Billy Joe Robideau is a great name for a baseball player or a country music singer. He looked like he could have been either one of them. He's listed at 6'1", 200. I think he was 6'1", 230 at least. And the name Billy Joe Robideau is just great. That's all I have about him. Joaquin Andujar. I think of him as a Cardinal. This is his first year with the A's. He played for the Astros before the Cardinals. We always thought it was fun that there was a pitcher whose name sounded like the word walking. That seems like a bad name for a pitcher. He did walk a fair number of players, but not a ton. He was a really good pitcher for the Cardinals, especially in 1982, 15-10 with a 2.47 ERA, probably his best year. From Samperio de Macorís in Dominican Republic, where a lot of good players have come from. Up next is Frank Tanana. If you ever want to be surprised about a player's career, look at Frank Tanana's baseball reference page and say, wow, Frank Tanana was a lot better than I thought he was. He had kind of two different careers. He was a fireballer. He struck out 269 players in one season in 1975. Had a 2.63 ERA. He was really, really good with the Angels. And then I assume he got hurt at some point because then he went from a strikeout pitcher to a crafty lefty and had kind of two separate careers, but he pitched for a long time and was a lot better than you think he was. So check that out. Up next is Bill Gullickson. Bill Gullickson, same person in my mind as Bob Tewksbury, and another guy who didn't throw very hard, didn't strike out many guys, but had a pretty long career. And he had a stint where I thought he was going to be pretty good, and I collected a bunch of his cards, and I've probably got 80 Bill Gullickson cards just sitting somewhere in one of these notebooks behind me. Up next is a little superstar specials card. Wade Boggs and Keith Hernandez on base. Wade Boggs of the Boston Red Sox and Keith Hernandez of the New York Mets are two players who can drive pitchers goofy. Every time it turns around, it seems that Boggs and Hernandez are on base. So it looks like they led their leagues in on-base percentage. Hernandez was .413. Boggs was .453. Wade Boggs was crazy good at getting on base. He had 200 hits and 100 walks almost every year. Just super, super good. And Keith Hernandez, very underrated, probably should be in the Hall of Fame. Up next is Brad Havens. pitched for the Dodgers later. If I remember right, he had, no, maybe that was Dennis Cook. Same player as Dennis Cook. But yeah, Brad Havens, I think, came over to the Dodgers for the 88 season, 89, somewhere around there. Pitched for the Dodgers, but not for very long. He might have been in the Tom Niedenfuer trade when the Dodgers traded, I can't remember. Anyway, yeah, I think maybe the Dodgers traded Tom Niedenfuer to the Orioles for Brad Havens. Maybe I'd have to look that up. Up next is Joel Skinner. Joel Skinner's dad, and maybe his grandpa too, all played in the big leagues. Definitely his dad. And he was a catcher. I think of him as an Indian. He's on the Yankees in this card. Had been on the White Sox. Maybe the Indians was after this. Probably after this because, yeah, White Sox and Yankees so far here. Don't know much about him except that his dad played and he was a catcher. Lonnie Smith. We had a Lonnie Smith card in the Topps pack, so not much new to add. And then saving the best for last. This would be an exciting card to get back then. Dwight Gooden. Dwight Gooden at this point was probably the best pitcher in baseball and the most exciting pitcher in baseball. He was young, he was awesome, and unfortunately injuries and drugs kept him from being what he could have been. But this is a good-looking card. The Mets color scheme fits well with the 1987 Fleer color scheme, and it's just a really good-looking card. So that's Dwight Gooden, and that is it for this. Hope you guys enjoyed this YouTube exclusive, cracking open some cards. I always enjoy opening baseball cards, looking at baseball cards, talking about baseball cards. These 87 boxes, what I happen to have right next to me opened up. So I have packs available all the time. So that's going to do it for me for today. I've already said all my spiel. So all I'm going to say is thanks for sticking around for this. Hope you enjoyed this and love to hear your comments. And we'll talk to you tomorrow.